Amazon AC2 and VPC support both IPv4 and IPv6 addressing protocols. By default, Amazon VPC uses the IPv4 addressing protocol. You can't disable this behavior. When you create a VPC, you must specify an IPv4 CIDR block, a range of private IPv4 addresses. You can optionally assign an IPv6 CIDR block to your VPC, and assign IPv6 addresses from that block to instances in your subnets. Amazon supports public, private, and elastic IPs. Whenever we launch an AC2 instance, a public and a private IP get allocated to it. It can be viewed in the description section of AC2 instance in Management Console. We have public DNS or IP. It is allocated from a pool of available IPs, and it is mandatory, and let you connect from anywhere around the globe, to your AC2 instance. Private IP. Its allocation is based on VPC's subnet, in which AC2 is set up. Every subnet has a range of IPs, out of which one IP gets allocated to the launched AC2. Scope or visibility of this IP is only under the defined VPC. Hence, to communicate between two or more instances using private IP, all must be under the same VPC. Private IP designated to an instance remains same until VPC is same. Elastic IP. It is similar to static IP and can be assigned to any AC2 instance. Once we assign it, existing public IP gets released and replaced with the newly assigned elastic IP. They are allocated to the AWS account so that we can release it from specific instance and reassign it to any other instances. Networking has two sorts of IPs: IPv4 and IPv6. IPv4 is 32 bits or 4 bytes in size. IPv6 is 48 bits or 6 bytes in size. The size of IPv4 has some limitation because of the 32-bit size. It supports a maximum of 3.7 billion different addresses in the public space. And that is the main reason IPv6 is introduced. With the exploding devices in IoT space, where each device is assigned a unique IP address, IPv6 solves this. Except for devices in IoT, IPv4 is still the most common format used. IPv6 is newer and solves problems for the Internet of Things, IoT. Public addresses. A public IP is an address that can be reached from the Internet. You can use a public address for communication between the Internet and your instances. The best use case for public IP addresses is for small projects where a dynamic IP can be used without much overhead. AWS has over 1 million public IP addresses and is constantly adding new ones. Public IP and elastic IP addresses are similar in the sense that they are both public and allow instances to communicate with the Internet. However, they differ because of the way they are associated with AC2 instances. Public IP addresses are assigned to your instances automatically from Amazon's pool of public IPv4 addresses once they are launched, and remain assigned to the instance until the instance is stopped. If an instance is stopped, a new public IP address will be assigned once the instance is started. Private addresses. A private address in AWS is an IP address that is not reachable over the Internet. You would use private addresses for communication between instances in the same virtual private cloud, VPC. Private IP addresses remain associated with the instance when it is stopped or rebooted. It will only disassociate once the instance is terminated. When launched, an instance can be assigned a private IP address. A AC2 will automatically assign an IP address to the instance within the address range of the subnet. If you don't specify a primary private IP address, AWS selects an available IP address in the subnet range for you. An additional private IP address, known as secondary private IP address, can also be assigned. Now, elastic IPs. Elastic IP addresses are used to manage its dynamic cloud computing services. Within the Amazon infrastructure, customers have virtual private clouds. And in VPCs, users have instances. The elastic IP address is what is used to advertise the data to public Internet. It seems there isn't much difference between a public IP address and an elastic IP address. But they are not the same. Elastic IP is a combination of a public IP address and a static IP address. It allows you to continue to advertise AWS instances within your network infrastructure even across reboots of instances. But to fully understand the elastic IP, we should understand static IP addresses and public IP addresses. What is a static IP? Your Internet Service Provider, also called as ISP, provides you an IP address. This advertises your computer to the Internet. An IP address is like your home postal address, which is a piece in a larger city block. A city block, in Internet language, is a network prefix. To go one step further, network prefixes are part of autonomous systems. When connecting people to the Internet, ISPs will assign an IP address to your computer. The IP address that is assigned to you is most likely a dynamic IP address. This is the most common for residential customers. This means that the IP address changes frequently, which provides customers and ISPs cost savings. In the case of India, Airtel changes IP addresses frequently. The alternative to this system is the static IP address. This is an IP address that never changes. If you are running a dynamic cloud environment, this would be necessary for advertising your content to the public internet. This is a primary function of elastic IPs, which contain the static IP address component. A static IP is useful for various reasons. In cloud computing, this is advantageous for DNS queries. If IPs are changing, this can affect the content loading process. In a nutshell, static IP addresses are IPs which does not change at all. It is because of that, it is allocated to your AWS account, rather than with a specific instance. When you associate an elastic IP address with an instance, it remains allocated to your account, and specific instance until it is disassociated from either. Elastic IP addresses are most commonly used to help with fault-tolerant instances or software. For example, if you have an EC2 instance that has an elastic IP address, and that instance is stopped or terminated, you can remap the address, and re-associate it, with another instance in your account. You can also reattach the same IP address to the same EC2 instance when it is restarted, allowing IP-based connections to work seamlessly, and making it possible to start and stop instances to save money, while not in use, without losing the IP address. When it comes to pricing, you can use one elastic IP address while your instance is running at no charge. But, if you have additional elastic IP addresses associated with the instance, or have an AIP reserved, and do not use it, you will be charged a small hourly rate of $0.01 per hour. With an elastic IP address, you can mask the failure of an instance or software by rapidly remapping the address to another instance in your account. An elastic network interface is a logical networking component in a VPC that represents a virtual network card. You can create a network interface, attach it to an instance, detach it from an instance, and attach it to another instance. The attributes of a network interface follow it, as it's attached or detached from an instance and reattached to another instance. When you move a network interface from one instance to another, network traffic is redirected to the new instance. Each instance has a default network interface called the primary network interface. You cannot detach a primary network interface from an instance. You can create and attach additional network interfaces. The maximum number of network interfaces that you can use varies by instance type as well. We do this to increase throughput or run some specific applications like routers kind of services.